Right. Starting a bit later today than planned, but better late than never. Continuing our daily project that we started yesterday of discussing an Indian Chassidus every day. We'll conservatively say we're aiming for every day of Kislev, but we'll see. So today I would like to discuss a Torah of the Alter Rebbe and ultimately of the Mittel Rebbe as well, that addresses the subject of beauty and aesthetics, and that's in general, but also, as we'll see, specifically with regards to women, the connection between women and the concept of beauty. And I'll start by thanking the individual who suggested this topic, this material, and as always, I welcome suggestions like these. It helps save me time in looking and searching. Now, since there is no official time limit, so I'm not looking to hurry here, and there's a lot of material on this. So my goal, my mindset going into this is we'll cover whatever we can cover. We can always continue another time, but even with that attitude, just in the process of preparation, things always just get longer and longer. But we'll see. You'll see. Now, even though I approached this, just to finish a few more quick hakdamas, even though I approached this topic expecting to explore the angle of Alter Rebbe and the subject of beauty, but in the process of preparing this, I realized that essentially there's a polemic here. The Alter Rebbe is engaging in a polemic against some other unspecified approaches to the place and importance of beauty, and as well as to the correct and proper approach to the stories in the Torah Bechlal, which in the subject, when it comes to debating how to approach the stories of Torah, one of the ultimate examples of that happens to be the stories of Yaakov and Rachel, as we'll see. So this will also be emphasized in this presentation as well. So just to set your expectations going into this, the YouTube, the video, the title for the video on YouTube will be Be'erach, exposing the people behind the beauty agenda. Who is the Alter Rebbe attacking, or something like that. So the following Torah of the Alter Rebbe was first printed in the Sefer Mamari Admar Azak Torah Umaydim Chelik Aleph. That's where they put stuff that have Dibra Maschels from Sukkim in the Torah that didn't have another place to go in the Sfarim that are Lafi Seder Hashanim. But only many years later, they printed a Sefer of Mamari Admar Azaken on Tafkuf Ayin Beis, which is the last complete year that the Alter Rebbe was alive and leading the Chabad community. At the end of Tafkuf Ayin Beis in Elul, he had to flee Napoleon, and a few months of fleeing, and then the Alter Rebbe passed away in the beginning of Tafkuf Ayin Gimel. So the Tafkuf Ayin Beis itself also apparently initially seemed to have less material. They didn't print a sefer for Tafkuf Ayin Beis, so the material was included in Amari Admar Azak and Torah Umaydim. But now, since Tafshin Samach Vav, when they printed Tafkuf Ayin Beis, so this appears in Sefer Tafkuf Ayin Beis, page Kuf and onward. When I got my act together, we got this show more smoothly on the road. I'll be able to share links on WhatsApp, on the chat, dedicated to the shiurim, so people can follow along, but I'm not going to attempt that right now. Let's move forward. So this is printed in Tafkuf Ayin Beis. You have two short shtiklach that are the hanacha, the way that Tzemach Tzedek wrote it down, and the Tzemach Tzedek writes these, as we'll see, pretty bekitzer. And like I mentioned yesterday, as usual, is always the question of when you have a short version, you have a long version. How did the Alter Rebbe say it? Was it shortened or was it lengthened? The Chazak is that the Mittel Rebbe often lengthens things. So we have the very short Tzemach Tzedek version, and we have a very lengthy Mittel Rebbe version, and then in addition we have the Mittel Rebbe in Teiras Chaim, which is presented Melachatchila as Mittel Rebbe's own take, the Mittel Rebbe's own version of these Mamarim, Arichas Gedola. So we have three versions, you could say, of this mimer. I think there are also Haggais of the Tzemach Tzedek, which I didn't even have a chance to look at in our Torah. And I'll be honest, I haven't even gotten the chance to really go through Teres Chaim or even the Hanacha of the Alter Rebbe here. But there's so much to work with here. It's interesting to think about, to discuss what's going on in Tafkuf Ayin Beis in the later years. My impression has been, I'm always interested in paying attention to the process of what the Alter Rebbe was saying and how he was saying it. My impression is that in the last years, there are fewer drushim. Doesn't seem like the Alter Rebbe was saying regular mamarim that often, and there seem to be a lot of shtiklach, a lot of k'toim, dafka from the writings of the Tzemach Tzedek, and they all seem to be on the shorter side. I wondered whether the Alter Rebbe was learning with the Tzemach Tzedek or something like that. And as we'll see here, these are also two shtiklach that both begin with the word inyan. So as I've touched on, is this genre within the Alter Rebbe's Torah, where it seems like the Alter Rebbe is just sitting and explaining something and not saying an entire formal Torah. And we'll see in a moment what the Alter Rebbe seems to be focusing on here, what the Alter Rebbe is coming here to discuss. 1 second. All right, so let's start. Like I said, it's Tafkuf Ayin Beis Omid Kuf. And there it says, and we'll start with the second shtickle, Inyan Shenamar B'Imohos Shahoyu Yefei or Yefeis Tayar V'Yefeis Mar'eh. The women, the Imohos in the Torah, are explicitly described as being Yefas Tayar, Yefas Mar'eh, which in simple English means that the Torah is saying, hey, they were very beautiful. So the question is, Ma ba Moshe lahashmienu? What's Moshe coming to tell us? Interesting wording. And then Alter Rebbe says, V'chila poishem hu noisen yad chas v'sholem shemechicha mikan hakpada al hayofi chulu. Is Moshe here to give the poishem, give the bad guys, whoever they might be? Is he here to give them a hand? He's here to support them, to assist them, chas v'sholem? The poishem who use this to prove that there's an importance, there's an emphasis on yofi and on beauty. Shleima Seiser Dvarav. Shleima contradicts this, he debunks this, disproves this. So we know that beauty is not chashav, beauty is not important. So how could it? And from the language, it almost sounds like Shleima Seiser Dvarav. Who's he? Of Moshe. Moshe came and said that the Imaris were Yefei Tov Yefei Mar'eh. Shlomo says Dvarim and says Sheker Achein V'Havel Hayofi. Shlomo says it's narishkeit, it's nonsense. So why would Moshe be telling us information, details that are Sheker and Havel? So just to pause, I'm going to read a piece at a time and explain the Fiarech Bekitzer. It seems that the Alter Rebbe is disturbed, as many perhaps today are in varying forms, from the style here in the Psukim. And it's interesting the way it's attributed to Moshe, like was kommt Moshe uns zu sagen. That's what it sounds like, a translation of that Yiddish phrase. Was kommt Moshe? So like attributing it to Moshe, like what's Moshe doing here? Right? Because even today, obviously there's different ways of saying it, but certainly today, when commenting on someone else's appearance, it often skews towards not being perceived as being an edle manner of speech. Oh, that person, oh, they're ... And as we'll see, the other shtickle here, the other kata, also begins with what seems to also be a question about the whole dimension and aspect here of love. That there's a love story here between Yaakov and Rachel that even though it's not stated as explicitly there as it is here it's mamash shtak kasha, but it's reasonable to understand the other shtickle is also addressing that question, which is talking about love here. What's going on? So this starts off already on a pretty polemical note, and as we'll see as we go on. I'll make particular note of this lashon lepoishim, b'chila poishim hu noisen yad. It almost sounds like the Alter Rebbe is referring to specific people, to a specific idea, a specific belief, and I'll elaborate on what I might suggest as possible identification when we get to the end, because that's my current thought is to try not to go off too barichas in the middle as opposed to the end. So continuing in the Alter Rebbe says, Inyan, כי בחינת היופי הוא גם כן בשורשן למעלה מהארץ הכסר, שנמשך ומאיר במלכות דווקא. That the concept of beauty, ultimately, at its root, is the ha'ara of Keser. We have this musig of Keser in Kabbalah and Chassidus, and when the ha'ara of Keser is to be found in a darga bechina somewhere below Keser, when that ha'ara Keser is to be found there, that's described as yofi. And where do we find the ha'ara of Keser? We find that dafka in Malchus. That's where Keser shines, and that's where we find the concept of yofi. And why is it dafka Malchus? Because as we know, this is the famous rule repeated many times, that the top is always connected to the bottom, the beginning is always connected to the end. So Keser is tchilasan, and Malchus is seifan. So Keser is dafka connected to Malchus. And the Alter Rebbe adds, "K'mashal tigbayres hashemesh ba'aver hashlishi hasamuch la'aretz b'yoser mi ba'aver ha'emtzoi." Like the mashal of how the light of the sun is stronger in the third atmosphere near the earth more than the middle air. Now, what's this reference here? What's this mashal? So this mashal appears at greater length, greater elaboration in Alter Rebbe's Torah in Tafkuf Samachei. The Alter Rebbe said a maimer, a drush v'yadata, and then he said a beer. Like the Torah of the Alter Rebbe was to say a lighter version of the Torah and then a heavier, deeper, more Kabbalistic version of the Torah. So in the beer for v'yadata, Tafkuf Samachei, which you can find in the Mamorim of Samachei, Chelik Beis, page Tafshim Aleph. The Alter Rebbe, I'll quote from there as well. The Alter Rebbe says there, why dafka Malchus gets this ha'ara from Keser? You're going to tell me we know this. The reason is not schlas misayfen. Dr. Alter Rebbe, he gufa tzricha tam. And can you tell me why? Lama not schlas misayfen dafka. Why taka? What's up is taka that tchilasin is connected to sayfen v'lei be'emtza? Maybe tchilasin should be notes be'emtza. It's a little geschmack, I'll say in a personal, it's a little geschmack to see when the rule that we always repeat as a rule gets challenged a little bit. It's, the famous rule, why taka? Why is it taka this way? So the Alter Rebbe says there, we know the light of the sun shines, it illuminates the earth. We see that the heat of the sun only spreads dafka on earth, v'loy be'emtza chal not in the empty space in the middle. Gimel chelkei avira yesh. There's three sections of air. And the middle air does not get heated at all from the heat of the sun. It's only when the heat of the sun reaches the third, which is the one that's near the earth, then the light starts shining and heating. That's meaning that's even before it hits the earth. The closer you get, once it starts approaching the earth, then you start sensing the heat. And the closer it gets to the earth, so then the heat gets stronger. And when it reaches the earth itself, then the heat hits very strong. The ikar chamimus samach la'aretz mamashu, and the ikar heat is mamish close to the earth. The gam samach l'shemesh atzma, then also all the way close to the sun. As we know, you can't go too close to the sun. It's even an expression. So you can't right near the sun. By the first air, right? So we're calling it aver rishon, aver emtzoi, aver ashlishi. So the beginning of the aver rishon is also very hot, and at the end of the aver shlishi it's very hot. But in the middle, there isn't so much heat. And that's because the light, the rays are hitting their target. The energy from it hitting only arrives at the end when it's kayach of spreading. Right? The sun is traveling, the rays are traveling, so the power that makes it travel ends. And it's at the earth. There's no more room for it to spread any further. So then the rays of the sun hit the tremendous kayach. That's why the heat there is very strong. Whereas in the middle, where the spreading hasn't ended yet, therefore it doesn't hit as hard. As is explained in the Sifrei HaTeva, Alter Rebbe is attributing this idea to there. There's a musig of Ur Chayzer that's used in Kabbalah. So the Alter Rebbe says it's not just the word Ur Chayzer, it's related to this concept, this idea of Nikra Ur HaNichbal. There's also another term Ur HaNichbal, not as common, but another term as well. Because the hitting, when it hits, maybe there's a better word, but haka, when does it hit hard? That's dafka when it finishes spreading. That's also the idea behind the concept of Ur Chayzer, that you have to picture the light hitting its target and then bouncing back. That's the Ur Chayzer. And then the Alter Rebbe goes into the mashal of throwing a rock and the rock bouncing back. We're not going to go into that whole mashal. The Alter Rebbe concludes with it says, this is still on top of Samachay. Since the light really ends at the end, so that's where the Ur HaChayzer is, this concept of Ur HaChayzer, which the Alter Rebbe is switching to. So due to these two things, the that the ikar clap, when it hits hard at the end. And also the fact that it gets reflected back, it bounces back. So back to that mashal, that's why it's so hot, dafka near the earth, because that's where the haka happens, and that's where the Ur Chayzer happens. And that's where this term Ur HaNichbal comes from as well. Presumably that the Ur is being duplicated, it's being intensified. And then he continues and says, Malchus is Sefer the Kol Dargin, and that's where the Ur that comes from higher, that's where it ends, that's like the Hakah B'Seif, and that's where the Ur Chayzer is. And so that's the notes, Tchilasim B'Seif on Dafka V'lei Be'emtza, Mitam Mashal Hanal, B'Chaim HaShemesh V'Hakah Sa'even. So now the cloud notes Tchilasim B'Seif has more of a underlying logic that we can understand. So that's Ayin Sham. That's where the Alter Rebbe elaborates on this idea of the Aved Ashlishi, and it's cited in a number of places about the Tzemach Tzedek. So that's the lashon here. Bekitzer kamashal tigbeir seir hashemesh ba'aved ashlishi hasamach la'aretz b'yoser mi ba'aved ha'emtzai. Now we are a bit more familiar with this terminology. Now the question that I would find interesting here would be, what is the source of the Alter Rebbe for this information? Is it based on very old scientific ideas? Are we going back to the old Greek science, or was it based on newer ideas? As I mentioned, as I emphasized, Alter Rebbe himself attributes what he says here, Kumavur b'Sifrei HaTeva. So I think it's a fair question to ask which Sifrei HaTeva the Alter Rebbe meant. And that's what I'm asking: are these older ideas or are these newer ideas closer to the Alter Rebbe's time? And it should be self-understood, or it should be emphasized that the Alter Rebbe and Mikkel Rebbe in particular cite Sifrei HaTeva a lot, very, very much, if you start paying attention. And at the end of that's Bekitzer, and more barichas. I'll get back to this question at the end after we finish going through this Torah. So at any rate, we've already established that there's a link between Keser, Ha'aras HaKeser, and Yoifi. Wherever there's Ha'aras HaKeser, that's where there's Yoifi, and that is revealed, that appears Dafka in Malchus according to the Klau of Noatz Chilasim B'Seifim. And now the Alter Rebbe continues and says, V'kach lefi shebechinas Malchus Ragleh Yerdus. And now he seems to be adding an additional point. Specifically Malchus, because we know that Malchus Ragleh Yerdus, Malchus is the end of Atzilus, but then Eresh is going to descend into the lower realms. So therefore it needs more chizuk, needs more strength, it needs more help, more encouragement. So that's another reason, or another dimension to why it needs this Ha'aras HaKeser, why it needs this Yoifi. And this is also the idea of Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim, which are also linked to the idea of beauty elsewhere. The Shoshana and Zohar, the Shoshana has 13 petals, also linked to the idea of beauty, and so these are all different versions of the same idea, that Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim are Malchus, the Yoifi, the Ha'aras HaKeser is a Malchus. The Alter Rebbe just added this additional point about tzricha chizuk, and this is a notable point, and as we'll see. And now the Alter Rebbe returns to what he began with, which is the matter of beauty, and specifically in women. And the Alter Rebbe says, "V'lachach gam lamata." So because of what we have to explain the premise that it's beruchnius keser malchus. Once we've established that, so now lachach gam lamata. So the same is also below. B'teva habriya hanashim yafim me'anashim. That's why in nature women are more beautiful than men. And this is also something we need to unpack at some point. But let's continue. V'lachein chashku hasarim or sarei parev avimelech bahem. And that's why we find talk in the Torah, part of the plot of the Torah is that the women, the Imayas, are treated as objects of desire. The sarei parev desire them. The Sodom or Parev, either it's the Sodom or the kings themselves. As we'll see here, there's an emphasis on Sodom. So that's why this keeps on happening, because it's to emphasize this musig of the yofi of women, and that's we're still talking the Gashmias, that Teva Bria Anoshim Yafim or Yafis, and that's why you see this theme of this desire. But we're talking about the stories in the Torah. The Ikar was what was happening in the Shayrish Baruchnius. That it was the Sodom, the pardon of Imelech, Baruchnius, that wanted to derive Unika from what Sarah and Rivka represent Baruchnius. And it's Mitzayin here to I'm not going to get into that. That's already too much of a Maimer HaMuzgar. And the Mitzayin here, Tov Kufayim Beis, that there was another Drush of the Alter Rebbe on that pasuk that was also said around this time. So this is an interesting observation here from the Alter Rebbe about women. That's first of all, acknowledging that there's an association between women and beauty, and the way the Alter Rebbe is coming at it, that's seemingly just like he said in the Beruchnius, that Machos Tricha Chizuk. So the Alter Rebbe is alluding to the fact that in his framework, the reason why Nashim Begashmias have Yofi is also because they need Chizuk. They need Chizuk Begashmias, that women are starting from a certain disadvantage, and this is helping even things out and providing them an advantage. And this is something Alter Rebbe mentions in a number of places, and he explains it in more detail elsewhere. And that's something I want to speak about at length at some point. I thought it would be at the end today, but it probably won't be today. It probably will have to be in the next installment. I'll also take the opportunity to mention that we're talking about the Sodom, the Sarei Parev, and the Sodom Lamaila. So this ties in a little bit to yesterday. Yesterday we were talking about Chamar Medina and the Medinas and the Ayin Medinas and the Ayin Sodom, the Sodom Shalamaila. So I got feedback from someone, and just a kind of mokum to say that I appreciate artists and feedback, and especially if you have additional makairis that you think are of interest, that are relevant, and if it's taka is helpful and contributes, I'm happy to cite it and mention it on the next opportunity. So someone sent me that in Sefer Torah Shalom, the Sichus of the Rebbe Rashab, so on page 202 onwards, there are the conversations of the Rebbe Rashab from the summer of Tafresh Ayin Daled, 1914. It's from the Iman of the Frierdiker Rebbe, his son. And there, the Frierdiker Rebbe records that the Rebbe Rashab was speaking and discussing the beginning of World War I at the time. And the Rebbe Rashab was analyzing the matzav at the time in his style, similar to what I mentioned yesterday, but how the Alter Rebbe was analyzing the invasion of Napoleon, Bishaita in a similar style, which we find throughout with the Rebbeim on different occasions. And there on page 204, 205, you see that the Rebbe Rashab is seeking to be magdir, how taka it actually works out. We talk in Chassidus, the Ayin Sarim, the Medinas, but practice Garet, there's a World War I. How do the Sarim figure in? How do they fit into the picture here? And you see that the Rebbe Rashab is trying to piece it together. There's the Medinas, there's the Malachim, there's the Sarim. The Rebbe Rashab says he's not fully certain exactly how it works, the big countries, the small countries, and maybe it's not going to happen on this occasion, but maybe on some other occasion we can quote it at greater length. It's interesting. So back to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe explained the inyan of Yofi Lamayla, and he explained the inyan of Yofi Lamata, and that's the story with Sarah and Rivka. Then Alter Rebbe goes on and makes a general statement, V'kachi darka shel Torah, big blanket statement, Kachi darka shel Torah, Shetoichan l'rotzuf inyanim pnimiyim ha'imdim berume shel olam. The whole lashon here is very interesting, very unique, that the derech of Torah is that even if you have the chitzonius, that whatever the stories the Torah tells us are, but Toichan, the inside of the stories, is paved with inyanim pnimiyim, with deeper ideas that are very, very deep and important and fundamental, and very lofty. And Alter Rebbe seems to circle back to this polemical style and says, if you read the Torah and you think that the stories happen k'pshutan, kasav al zeh b'sefer echad, shteit in a sefer, she'einem mekabel schar al zeh klal. You don't get schar for that at all. So this seems to almost be the main reason that got the Alter Rebbe going here. The Alter Rebbe seems to be responding to someone, and the Alter Rebbe is trying to negate that. And in order to negate that, the Alter Rebbe is giving his own framework, his own explanation of how to understand this. But the way the Alter Rebbe comes back here to emphasize this seems like it was almost that was the impetus, the premise, and that's pretty interesting, pretty notable. And like I'm saying, not just in beauty specifically, but it seems to be about this the proper approach to the Sipurei HaTorah in general. Now the Alter Rebbe cites a Sefer Echad here. Kasav Azeh Sefer Echad. What's the Sefer Echad? So in the Mamari Tafkavayin Beis, they were Metzayin in the footnote, the Ma'ayin in the Sefer Degel Machne Ephraim. Degel Machne Ephraim is the Einikol of Baal Shem Tov, the Moshe Chaim Ephraim, the brother of Baruch HaMezhebush, another uncle of Menachem Breslov, etc. And the Sefer Degel Machne Ephraim was in fact printed for the first time in the year Tafkov Ayin. So that would be a year or two before the Alter Rebbe said this. So it could potentially actually be the Sefer the Alter Rebbe was referring to. If you look in Degel Machne Ephraim, he begins in Vayeshev Yaakov and he says a few different ideas. Then he says, so continuing in the vein of before, but to add something, Degel Machne Ephraim says, surely anyone who knows, anyone who has a brain, knows for sure. The Torah is eternal, mentioned, emphasized in Zayar. And then he says, Tipach ruchan min oisam sha'imnim she'im b'Torah rak sipurei ma'asiyos upshat. Stark lashon, we find in Chazal, what the exact translation is, but let them plots, the Sonim Zolim plots, and those who say that the Torah is just stories and pshat, if you say that, nikra apikoides. That's the lashon of Degel Machne Ephraim. So also very strong reaction to something. And he continues, and he says, V'vadek shmakin, who? Shema Torah, the Indian of Torah is, like its name suggests, Torah, like the Rebbe used to say, obviously, as we know, very often, but the Degel Machne Ephraim says it here, Shema Torah al Shem Lahiris, Hal Derech Hashanelach Ba, V'Samaisa Asher Nasim, Kach Mefurish Bikra, that's what Torah is, and that includes the Sipurim. I know Derech Mashal, he brings a Mashal, he says he heard from the Zayda, the Baal Shem Tov, that there were Gazlanim in a forest, and they would always send someone out as a ploy, as bait, to bait people to come into their territory. Once he lures them to their territory, then they can kill their victim and take his money. So there's always the person who's acting on behalf of the Gazlanim to lure people to them. So if you're smart, you don't fall for the trap. So that's his pasuk. He said, Aderech Hashanelach, well, it's Aderech HaYasher, not to follow the Yetzer Hara, like in the Mashal. Hamaisa Hashayasun is to tell us, Hamaisa, Hainu Af Hamaisi Yeshish B'Torah. Even the stories in the Torah, Hashayasun, you have to act on them. Gam Lo'olam, Ki Advarim Him Chayim V'Kayomim Lo'olam. And this is in Vayeshev, which is also in these parshias. Ubevadai, so there he's talking about the Yeshiv. So surely the Indian of Yeshivas Yaakov also has a tremendous Seidus. And he goes on to Taich Ois, Megure, etc. So what the Alter Rebbe and what the Degamach and Ephraim are saying is that it's not just that we find Svarim that Darshan explain the Torah al Pipshat, Remez, Drush V'Soid, so it could be seen as a sort of drush. They seem to be going out of their way to emphasize that it's almost like there's no pshat. You can't read it as pshat. You read it as pshat, it's no good. But it has to be read l'chatchila as reflecting, as embodying, as expressing something deeper. Now, what exactly that itself means is also worthy of discussion. Needs to be discussed and ironed out what exact formulation of what they're trying to say here is. And this is b'chlal a big shaila in chinuch. Comes up, the conversation comes up from time to time. How best to teach, including in cheder. How do you teach the stories of Torah and cheder? We know that in certain circles they have the term Tanakh, begova ha'inayim or begova ha'shamayim. Are we saying that Tanakh is at eye level, very human stories, or are they begova ha'shamayim? We can't understand them as relatable. And of course, there really are many dargas. It's not the binary. It's not black and white. It's not like there's two options here. Like I said, even if you touch it up pisad, there's still the question of how much room are you still leaving for how the story actually took place, the gova ha'inayim, etc., etc. And I'll touch on this a little bit at the end as well. And here the Alter Rebbe, we'll continue with Alter Rebbe. Here the Alter Rebbe seems to want to add another detail about the Hagdara of Sefer Bereshis. Sefer Bereshis is a sefer of stories. So what's the gather of Sefer Bereshis? So the Alter Rebbe says, "V'hinei Allah hiksuva al Sefer Yashar." This is the lashon in Sefer Yeshua. Yeshua speaking, he says about something, Allah hiksuva al Sefer Yashar. And what is it referring to? A kavanah al Sefer Bereshis. That's what it says in Chazal and Gemara by the Zara. My Sefer Yashar is that Sefer of Ramitzuk v'Yaakov shenikra Yesharim. So it's referring to Sefer Bereshis from the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. And that is Shek Koidem L'Torah. Sounds like he's saying it comes before the rest. You call it Dalet Svarim, the other for him, Gufei Torah, but B'yor HaMitzvahs. That's when you think of Torah, usually you think of those four, because it talks about the mitzvahs, Yiddishkeit. But the Alter Rebbe, V'yeshua and Beis Kaven, Yeminu Smoil, Esen V'lei Saseh, Zeh Keneged Zeh. So those four, what you call the standard part of Torah, there's this bifurcation, there's right and left, there's do's and don'ts. Masha'en can Sefer Bereshis hu b'vchinas Yosher. The kulay b'vchinas echad achas. It's an aleph. So however you want to be able to mefanech. So the other parts of Torah, they have there's some kind of bifurcation, there's some kind of divide. Bereshis is Sefer Yosher, it's Yosher, it's alt eins. Malach and Amar Razal. That's why there's a chavivus, even if it's the sichasin shalab the avis and bereshis, but it's bereshis. Bereshis has a maila over everything else. And so there's an interesting hagdara here that the Alter Rebbe is saying about Yosher versus Yemin Ismail, but that's already beyond the focus here that I want to focus on. So we're going to leave that for now. We're going to continue focusing on the discussion surrounding beauty and the Sipurei HaTorah. So after the Alter Rebbe explained generally that surely when we say Yoifi, Yefas Toyer, Yefei Toyer, surely it has a deeper meaning, and the Iker is Lamaila. But now the Alter Rebbe returns to explain and define more specifically what's the difference between Yefei Toyer, Yefei Mara, Sayin the Mashal Begashmias, and Sayin the Nimshal Baruchnias. And since there is some Gashmistic component to what the Alter Rebbe will explain, so ultimately that does demonstrate that even for the Alter Rebbe, the concept of beauty, the musig of beauty, begashmias, also occupies a certain place, a certain space, which is the original thought I had going into this. But especially today, we're emphasizing more of what the Alter Rebbe is negating versus what the Alter Rebbe is actually describing and emphasizing. But the Alter Rebbe goes on and says, the difference between Toyer and Mara is, when you say that someone has Toyer, I know in Hasider Nachin, Bivinian Haivarim and Maziga, Shlayad of Midas Saachas, Yakatsumidasai, Bikamoy Haroy Elias, if you Midas Haivarim Achedim, Eliu, Kulam Shkulam. It's that everything is proportionate. All the Haivarim are proportionate to one another, nothing's too big, nothing's too small, in relation and proportion to all the rest. The four senses of the Iya, Shmiya, Reach, Dibur, seeing, hearing, smelling, and speech. You, Kulam and Maziga, also, they should all combine nicely You shouldn't have a disproportionate koyach of one and much weaker koyach of the other. They should also all be b'meziga with each other. Interesting, the Alter Rebbe mentions that as well. That's toyar, and that's yifei toyar. Lamayl, that's begashmius, and lamayl beruchni is hainu bechinas hameziga b'sfiras al yainas chesed derei yamina v'uda derei smala she yikoyach shel zeh kafi aroi lias neged shalamasi. They should have the right combination of chesed and gvura lamayla. I think the Alter Rebbe's description of what toyar is, what yifei toyar is, isn't that different than the discussions in the classical Mefarshim here. The classical Mefarshim also discuss this because, if you want to explain pshat in the pasuk, what's the distinction between toyar and mara? So they have to explain the difference. So I'm not sure that Alter Rebbe is saying anything that's majorly different that departs from that. But when we get ultimately to the way the Mittel Rebbe touches on this and describes it, I think in the Mittel Rebbe takes it to the next level, and it will be interesting to see. So it would also be interesting to check the Alter Rebbe's description to see if there's anything notable here compared to what others say. Oh, this is pretty classic. So that's toyar. That's, well, it's hard to translate precisely, but it's from the context there, it's perhaps you would say in English, the fact that someone's handsome, meaning there's being symmetrical. Today we talk about symmetry, so that's similar to toyar. But in addition to the raw symmetry, there's the actual personality, the soul, the vibe, etc., that actually comes across through the face. That's what Alter Rebbe calls a hidur b'klaster panim, and that in Kabbalistic terms is hu b'chinas hamakifim. And then it adds in parentheses shreimash ein leklaster panim and calls it ein shini be'etzem mezigas hevanim. Because if someone lacks a cluster panim, if someone lacks that, it doesn't change the proportion of their limbs. Their limbs could be well proportioned, but they still don't have it. They still don't have the cluster panim. So Bazoi, that's he's trying to prove that it's makif, because it can't be accounted for by looking at the actual building blocks of the face. So if it's not in the building blocks of the face, so what is it? Hidur, the cluster panim, the hidur. Where does that come from? Hurak hashra samakif. There's some kind of energy that's enveloping your face, that's coming across through the face, but it's not something that can be identified and defined within the face itself. The word today, I guess, that comes closest, both for people and for makifim, would be an aura. Someone has an aura that they give off. And so Alter Rebbe is linking this to the concept of makifim, which is a term that's used very much in Kabbalah. So the concept of makifim corresponds to this. And this is where this Indian concludes in the writing of the Tzemach Tzedek. So even though we already spent some time on it, but it was still Fiyarach, pretty bekitzer, and the way that Tzemach Tzedek writes it. Now there's another kata here on the same page that's earlier that I mentioned, where Alter Rebbe addresses the Av and the Sinna, and I'll just say it, try to say it bekitzer. Inyan ki snua Leah, Yav is Rachel. Yaakov hates Leah and loves Rachel. So here there's no polemic writing, but like I said, it should be perhaps read similarly in light of the above. So that's perhaps what's bothering the Alter Rebbe. What's taka pshat, also the sprach of Sinna, Av. So the Alter Rebbe explains that it's alpi the musig of Leah and Rachel and Yaakov in Kabbalah. So Leah is Eim Habonim Smecha, well not Smecha, is Bechinas Eim Habonim. It's Seichel, that's she's Shemidah Shisha Shvatim, so the Vav Midas are born from Leah, so she's above that. And that's why Yaakov, who his inyan is Midas, Lamata Mea Seichel, he couldn't recognize Leah, because Leah was higher, Leah was beyond his inyan. Now, when we say that she's seichel, we have to be medayek. Alter Rebbe says it's bechina ha'achrena shebeseichel, eisias ha'machshava, which are levushi ha'seichel, right? So we say that Leah is machshava and the Rachel is dibur. So, but for the purpose of what we're saying here, we're saying Leah is eisias ha'machshava, which is bechina ha'achrena shebeseichel, which is still higher than Midas. And that's why she's called Leah. Interestingly, lashon ha'yefus, like we see by Leit and Stein and the Malachim and the people of Stein, by Yilu, Limtzei, Leah is lashon tired. She nilatom is exhausting. It's constantly machshav meshetetas tamid. Even when we're dreaming, we can't turn our mind off. So that's Leah. It's the mind's constantly thinking. So even though it's oisis machshava, but it's still higher than midas, which are completely below seichel. That's why she's out of Yaakov's league in that sense, that Yaakov couldn't appreciate her. Which is Lamata from Midas, which is Yaakov. That's why Leah was Snua, because it's if you don't get it, if you can't comprehend it, how can you like something you don't get it? So if it's not ohov, then it's Snua. Something you understand that you get, that you enjoy. So Rachel, he enjoyed, he related to Rachel. Obviously, I'm using regular terminology, but the Alter Rebbe is speaking seemingly almost entirely Baruchnius. That's why Rachel was beloved, and that's why marrying Leah was Shlemi Daitoi. He wasn't even really consciously aware, because she's beyond his comprehension. Das also has a technical term, but that's all before they married. But then once they're married, then they have a connection. He's a Baal, he's a Mashpila. So Machshava descends, whatever the technical explanation is. So here, like I said, there's no polemics here, but the fact that these two are a pair and come together, I think it can also be read as also the Alter Rebbe is presenting and demonstrating how to read the story of the Sin and the Ava in a Ruchnistic way. As we'll see later, the Alter Rebbe, when he wrote on this Torah, he merged the two inyanim together into one. And I guess we'll get to that. So those are the two shtiklach of the Alter Rebbe's Torah as they're written by the Tzemach Tzedek here. And that's, for now, that's all from reading directly from within the Torah of the Alter Rebbe. But now I have a few things to add here. So first of all, the beginning, the Alter Rebbe mentioned the Poishim, as Moshe being Mason Yad La Poishim Chas V'Shalom, HaMechichem Al Hakpad B'Inyan HaYofi. I'm paraphrasing or quoting from memory here. So I asked, it sounds like the Alter Rebbe is referring to a very specific group of people. So the obvious line of thought here would be to wonder whether the Alter Rebbe is referring to some form of haskala to the circles of the maskilim in his day. Because as we know, if we had to simplify maskilim versus the non-maskilim in Eastern Europe, maskilim tended to look down on Eastern Europe as being very backward and lacking progress and lacking culture and seder and cleanliness. So it feels like Yofi could end up somewhere in that clash. And also, so that's the question: is the Alter Rebbe referring to that? And can we find an explicit source of the Alter Rebbe says the Mechichem? They're proving from here. So can we find a source of someone who was taka using these psukim as proof? That's something we need to explore and look into. But I will mention that Moses Mendelssohn, who's a pretty big name in that sphere, pretty infamous, and time-wise, he was actually a generation before the Alter Rebbe. He's about the same range of years as the Alter Rebbe's father. He lived from 1729 to 1786, so he was already finished and gone before the Alter Rebbe even really fully took off in the Tafkuf Nuns, the Tafkuf Samachs. And we know that Moses Mendelssohn wore different hats, and among other things, he actually was considered a pretty serious member of the circle in Germany at the time who were developing relatively modern German philosophy. So for those who are familiar, that's when you look him up, part of why he's famous is he's not famous per se for being a maskil. He's famous for his contributions to the discussion of philosophy in his day. And if you look it up, you'll see that actually one of the major themes in Mendelssohn's philosophical thought, happens to be the matter of beauty and aesthetics. If you look, for example, in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, in the entry from Moses Mendelssohn, and I'll just give a disclaimer here, I don't consider myself a big versteher in philosophy and in German philosophy, so whatever follows is I'm just quoting. And also, I guess, a warning if you want to be nizar and not to be makabel here thoughts and ideas directly from Mendelssohn, so I guess you should probably tune out and skip this, but I'm going to quote a little bit from their entry. So in their entry, there's a subheading, a subsection of aesthetics, contribution to the philosophy of aesthetics. They write, I'll quote a bit, Mendelssohn makes singular contributions to the development of the newly developing discipline of aesthetics in 18th century Germany. In his work on the main principles of the fine arts and sciences, which I assume was in German, he wrote both in Hebrew and in German, I believe this is in German, Mendelssohn sets out from the assumption that the human spirit has learned to imitate beauty, the self-empowered mistress of all our sentiments, to quote him, in works of art. We're imitating beauty in works of art. He then proceeds to ask what the arts have in common, or in other words, what beauty is. They write, Mendelssohn contends that the common feature is a sensuously perfect representation. Sensuous in this connection stands not simply for the fact that an object is sensed, but also for the fact that an entire array of an object's features is perceived all at once. To have a sensuous representation is to perceive something without intellectually distinguishing its parts or aspects, but we can sensuously perceive an order or harmony to those aspects without intellectually distinguishing them. Beauty, or the perfect sensuous representation, whether in nature or in art, accordingly pertains to forms, orders, harmonies, and indeed, quote, everything capable of being represented to the senses as a perfection. In this connection, he argues that as far as individual beauties in nature are concerned, they are inferior to the beauties produced by arts. In his On the Main Principles, Mendelssohn also establishes the general distinction between fine arts and fine science along the lines of the difference between natural and artificial science. Whereas the fine arts, music, dance, painting, sculpture, and architecture, predominantly work with natural signs, the fine sciences, poetry and rhetoric, typically employ artificial signs. So these are hagdaras that are interesting if you actually care about precise philosophical hagdaras of these things that can hold up as a good hagdara. Obviously, most of us probably are not too concerned with the precise details, but this is just to demonstrate that he was being Isaac in trying to use a creative vocabulary and definitions for natural beauty, for beauty in the arts, etc. And obviously that means that they were pretty important to him if he's concerning himself with defining them. And a bit further, they write, Mendelssohn's conception of the experience as something affording us a pleasure. I think at the end of a quote. His conception is of something affording us a pleasure that is neither simply sensuous or intellectual. We consider the beauty of nature and art with pleasure and satisfaction without the slightest movement of desire. Instead, it appears to be a particular mark of beauty that it is considered with tranquil satisfaction, that it pleases if we also do not possess it, and we are still far removed from demanding to possess it. So he's being magder that you're not necessarily being roidef acheret, you're not being choymed it, you're just enjoying it for what it is, even if you have no shaykhs to it. That's what he's trying to be magder. Again, the point is that whatever the details of the abstract philosophical discussion, but he seems to be discussing the nature and definition and the pleasure of beauty. So we could perhaps find some commonality, some similarity between that and the Poishim that Alter Rebbe is describing, who emphasize the importance of Yofi. That's of course just an initial suggestion, and I'm sure there's a lot more that could be searched and researched, and there are definitely experts today who are much greater, much more proficient in the thoughts and teachings of the early Maskilim, etc., etc. I'll also point out that I happen to see that in Mendelssohn's other writings as well, in his work on the nature of the soul, which I believe he wrote in Hebrew and perhaps in German as well, he actually talks about Yaakov and Rachel in his in a signoin, in a style befitting him. I found a translation from Hebrew into English, and I'll quote a little bit of it, and again, with all the disclaimers above. This is what Mendelssohn writes. Let the following serve as an example. Jacob saw Rachel and fell in love with her. In this way, the figure of Rachel was imprinted in Jacob's heart as a consequence of the seeing. As a consequence of this representation, plans, thoughts, and wishes about pleasing her were aroused in his soul. As a consequence of these, he served her father 7 years, as if it were only a few days. At first glance, it seems, and a few of the philosophers assert this too, that the first representation reached by Jacob by physical influence. For it did not at all lie in Jacob's power to see that figure if it had not reached him from the external sense object. The cause of that seeing would therefore lie in the sense object activating the seeing, not on what was being acted on. Again, he's being medayek here, and there's nuances here in terms of the exact formulation of what causes what influences what, and the context there is trying to explain the nature of the soul and what the soul contributes and what the mechanics of that are. But he uses Yaakov and Rachel falling in love as his mashal. So maybe that's also somewhat relevant to this as well. Like I said, Mendelssohn is a pretty is the biggest figure of them all, and so his writings are much more highly documented, so it's easier to search there. But he was also a big deal in his time, so that's why he was seen as the representation of that circle. So either I'm searching where the street light is because it's easier to search there, or it's not a good direction to search in because he was pretty prominent, pretty central. And everything he had written was long before the Alter Rebbe was speaking on this occasion. I'll just mention in passing that with reference to how we talk about the Avos, we should know that there was a controversy in the Frum world a few decades ago about some of the works of Rabbi Steinsaltz, Evan Yisrael, where people also took issue with how he wrote about Yaakov and Rachel, as I recall. At any rate, it would also be interesting to search through the Alter Rebbe's writings to see if there are any other references like this to Poishim, to these bad people and their bad ideas. A subcategory of this is talking about the Alter Rebbe rejecting the place of Yofi according to these Poishim. The Poishim have a hakpada on Yofi, the Alter Rebbe is rejecting that. So that actually links for me to a very interesting point, which is that I have argued in various conversations that I, in a sense, view Chabad compared to other streams in Judaism as being the anti-aesthetic, the anti-beauty movement. And you can see this in the style of Chabad shows, both historically and today. You look at the main Chabad shows in the Chabad communities, they tend to not match up very well with shows in other communities. Not just shows, but other external beautification of mitzvahs. We know with esrog boxes and Megillas Esther cases, etc. So there's endless examples of this, Noy Sukkah, and many others. There are many examples. If you think along these lines, I think you'll find that Chabad consistently eschews and rejects the external beautification of mitzvahs of Judaism. The place of art, Bechlal, even a few hundred years ago in Poland, you can find shows that had beautiful, incredible art on the walls. There has been religious art, even in the Ashkenazi, even in the Eastern European world for hundreds of years, and Chabad seems to have been very, very far from it. The exception is that the Rebbe, in this generation, the Rebbe seemed to embrace and engage with art and artists in a way that hadn't been done before. And recently, there's been articles that have been written on the topic, which sparked some of this conversation, some of this discussion. So the Rebbe did embrace art to a certain extent, but we also have to qualify what the Rebbe did use art for and what the Rebbe didn't use art for. But the nature of, like I said, shuls, mitzvahs, Yiddishkeit, day to day, doesn't seem to have changed much under the Rebbe, the Ad Rebbe. There's probably much from the Frierdiker Rebbe as well. The Frierdiker Rebbe himself talks about art and aesthetics and different things. That's probably relevant to this discussion as well. And maybe we'll do a longer summary, a longer treatment of this when we get to the end of this whole topic, all these installments. But I just wanted to mention that at least bekitzer. Another point, another miluim v'hashlamis. Mentioned earlier that the Alter Rebbe mentions the Aver Hashlishi. Alter Rebbe mentions about the sun really only spreading its warmth in the Aver Hashlishi. And I asked, Alter Rebbe is attributing it to Sifrei HaTeva. What are the Alter Rebbe's sources? And I touched on this yesterday as well. And when I have the opportunity, when the opportunity presents itself, I try to do my best to identify all the Ma'amer Kaimis in the Alter Rebbe's teachings, and that includes when the Alter Rebbe says Sifrei HaTeva. I would like to know which Sifrei HaTeva. So I asked where this idea comes from, and how. You could also ask how it compares to the scientific understanding today of the atmosphere, etc. And I actually saw one of the Kaiftzim, one of the Chabad Kaiftzim, someone was writing Chassidus about this, and he actually mentioned the Lashon of the Aver Shlishi, he brings it from the Tzemach Tzedek. And in the footnote, he said, "Oh, Yesh Leimar," that it's like the atmosphere. He was using contemporary terms. So that's just how someone who came across an Chassidus was trying to process it. But can we do better? Can we track the understanding of the air and the atmosphere? So I actually found an academic article from 2015, and it's called "The Invention of Atmosphere," and it's essentially traces the intellectual development of the scientific understanding of the concept of atmosphere. And I'll quote a little bit from there. And while reading this, we can think about and compare to the classic Jewish sources that deal with these matters, whether it's the Rambam Mishnah Torah or there's the medieval Hebrew work Shar HaShamayim that contained the scientific knowledge up till that point. We know also that Aristotle's book on meteorology was translated into Hebrew by Ibn Tibbon, and that was in fact, the first scientific tract to be translated into Hebrew, etc., etc. So I'm going to quote a bit from the article. This is what the article says. The 17th century conceptual and linguistic origins of the atmosphere has been obscured by the widespread conflation of ancient and medieval conceptions of the regions between the Earth and Moon with the atmosphere. 16th century understandings of the composition of the region between the Earth's surface and the lunar orb were based on two interrelated traditions, Aristotelian natural philosophy and Ptolemaic middle or mixed sciences. Aristotle's account of the sublunar, I might mispronounce things, you'll have to forgive me, of the sublunary region, this is terminology that we are familiar with in Hebrew, even from Tanya. The sublunary region is whatever mitachas layireach, that's where the Daled Yesodus begin, whereas the Yereach and the heavenly spheres are not in the Daled Yesodus, kayidua. So Aristotle's account of the sublunary region played an outsized role in early modern natural philosophy. His writings, including the meteorology, formed the starting point for university lectures throughout the Middle Ages and early modern period. Without describing an atmosphere per se, the meteorology gave an account of the region between the Earth's surface and the Moon. Recent interpretations of the meteorology have found only two aerial regions above the Earth and below the sphere of fire, which we also are familiar with in Hebrew, that forms a border with the lunar orbit. You have the Yereach, then you have the Eish, Shalamata, Yereach. So now from there, further downward is the space between the Moon and the Earth. The recent interpretations of Aristotle's meteorology have found only two aerial regions. One aerial region reaches to the top of the mountains, meaning it begins below and it reaches to the top of the mountains, where the cycles where rain takes place, and the drier region sits above. This actually connects to the Ramban in Parshas Noach about Ararat and the mountains and the Shiloh of how could it rain at the top of the mountain. We're not going to get into that at all, but it actually is very related to this notion that there's one aerial region till the top of the mountains, and then there's a drier region above. Unlike modern interpreters, medieval and early modern fathers of Aristotle separated this aerial zone below the sphere of fire into three strata. So that's the Avir, Rishona, Mitzoy, Vashlishi. For medieval and early modern Aristotelians, the uppermost layer is hot and dry, largely composed of fiery exhalations. That's the Avir Rishon. The middle region is cold and wet, typically filled with vapors and clouds. That's the Avir HaMitzoy. And the lowest region is hotter than the middle region. That's the Avir HaShlishi, as we explained by Arichas. Reflection of sunlight on the Earth's surface warms it, exactly as we discussed. It goes on, this region is also wet, etc. The division of air into three regions ordered and defined species of meteorological phenomena, tying closely to the Aristotelian doctrine of place. Okay. Early modern Aristotelians were diverse, but there was widespread agreement about the existence of three regions of air. Quotes most of influential Aristotelian textbooks and treatises on meteorology printed in the 1600s. He lists a few names. They differed from each other in many aspects, but they stuck to the tripartite division, the three-part division of air. And this is still as of the 1600s. A few 16 or 15. 1600s. A few 16th century scholars arrived at drastically different conclusions. Quotes a few more people and their shittas. Despite the dissent, most 16th century natural philosophers retained the three divisions of the aerial region. He quotes a few other Chachamim. How can I start quoting them by name? But at some point, one of these fellows, seemingly in the 1600s, concluded that both the fiery region of Aristotelians and the division of the aerial region into three strata were fictions, but rather there are only two regions, a lower warm region, a colder upper region, which he called atmosphera. So that probably ties into the development of the musig of atmosphere, which is obviously a term we still use today. And see that article by Arichas about all the other details of the development of the concept of atmosphere till it reached the states that we have today. I think this all serves to illustrate, again, how much the Alter Rebbe essentially was trying to insert and integrate the scientific knowledge that he had within his Torah, that his model for the world, Al-Pi Kabbalah, Al-Pi Ruknius, should integrate the model of the physical world as it was known. Like I said, I think it was more dynamic for the Alter Rebbe and the Mittel Rebbe, and then at some point, all of these Yediyas sort of got frozen in place in Chassidus, and Chassidus doesn't add new Yediyas, so we're frozen in time with the way the Alter Rebbe and the Mittel Rebbe presented it. It would be interesting, in light of the above, to see how widespread this breakdown of the three Avirim was in other Yiddish Sfarim, or is it taka being disproportionately emphasized dafka by the Alter Rebbe because the Alter Rebbe had personally come across this Yediyah. Of course, it would still be interesting as well to try to match it up and make it fit with what we know today. But without getting into the nature of atmosphere, that's some idea of the Alter Rebbe, that it's hot near the sun and it's hot near the earth and it's cold in the middle, obviously is not up for debate. And even the way it's explained today is pretty similar to the general way the Alter Rebbe describes it, of the heat hitting and reflecting, and that's the source of the heat. I believe that's still how it would be explained today. So the other details might not be so directly important to the Nakuda the Alter Rebbe was trying to make about the Hakal and not Tchilas and B'Seifim. Another point which we touched on earlier, that the Alter Rebbe says that Malchus needs Chizuk, and implies similarly that Nashim have Yofi because Nashim need Chizuk, and we'll see later the Mittel Rebbe and his version of this, when we get to it, also touches on this. And I was wondering whether to go through the other Mekaydes to Alter Rebbe, but I figured we'll save it for next time. We speak about the beauty of women. Worth noting, there's also the Sikh of the Rebbe and the Kut Sichas about Chamisha Asr B'Av, Tenenechem B'Yofi, where the Rebbe also explains the Maila of Yofi. Maybe we'll touch on that as well in the future. We certainly don't have time for the Rebbe Rashab and Torah Shalom and the Ayin Sarim, but one final important point in discussion that I want to add and I guess conclude with. As I mentioned above, as we mentioned earlier, the Alter Rebbe is also touching here on the question of the correct approach in general to how to learn, read, and teach the stories in the Torah. And L'maisa, the Alter Rebbe is this error dafka with regard to our parsha. Bechlal, when the topic comes up, Bechlal, often the stories from Parshas Vayetze often tend to be the example that's used as representing sort of the ultimate challenge. And in particular, we find, if you have to pick one pasuk, it's probably Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel. Now, this discussion of this academic, you could say, discussion of how to teach, how to learn Torah, really also ties in. We find that it ties in somehow with the larger sociological question today about, within the frum world, what is the ideal dynamic connection relationship between husband and wife? As we know, in the frum world, the more Haredi you get, the more suppressed or withheld, or whatever term you want to use, it is. And there are those that push back and argue that it's not right. It's not it shouldn't be that way. And this is a general question, related question of how to approach a shidduch, how to search for a shidduch, what are you looking for? And in that context as well, often the story of Yaakov and of Rachel tends to come up. And in the last year or so, you may be familiar, maybe smiling right now, but there's a certain person, a certain persona in the Haredi world who's undergoing his own journey. And he made a big task out of this, that he's looking for love, he wants to live a life of love, and he points to Yaakov and Rachel as his inspiration, of course, emphasizing that it's with Kedusha, but it's still so it's a pretty relevant and ongoing topic and discussion, not just in how to teach in a cheder, but what it means and how it applies to how we organize our lives. So it would be interesting. It's interesting to think about this a bit now in light of the sources that we're exploring here. Because as we see, it almost looks like suddenly the Alter Rebbe, Dagamach and Ephraim, suddenly have this outburst of today. It's posed as a question, Vikam Hayitachan, Vikam and Zagan, Yaakov, etc. The Alter Rebbe doesn't pose it as a question, but poses it as like, you heard there's people that say it's Kapshuta, Chas v'Shalom, Apikairas, these Lashinas. So there's this outburst from the Alter Rebbe, the Dagamach and Ephraim. It would be interesting to see whether earlier sources also demonstrate this kind of, there's a question, a struggle, something that needs to be addressed and explained. So it looks like it really takes off here at this point at that time in history. And I would suggest as a possible way of thinking about it, of looking at it, in line with what I just mentioned about dynamics in marriage, that if we think about the history, the evolution, development of dynamics in marriage, we know that in the Western countries, in Western Europe, we know that over the course of a number of hundreds of years, the notion of love, of romance, took root and spread and took off. There was always the concept of marrying for beauty, and I actually touched on that recently with regard to Parshas Chayesara, Beina B'chai, etc. So it was usually framed as beauty, and there could be reference to love in marriage, but the concept of marrying for love, marrying for romance, was a concept that developed in slow motion in these Western countries. And although it's not clear how much of an actual impact Lamaisa it initially had, I think even as late as the 1800s, even in Western countries, the concept of marrying for love, living for love, really was still fighting to take root. But the seeds were planted already earlier, and this created an ideal of marriage, marrying for love, of love within marriage. And I'm just generalizing off the top of my head. There are many articles and books that treat the history, development of this phenomenon, which we take for granted today, but it took a lot of time and a lot of efforts for it to really take hold and spread. And these ideas, along with many other ideas, started spreading, in particular in the Western countries in the 1700s, including among the Jewish communities there. And this is reflected, for example, in the writings of Rabbeinu and Eibshitz and Yaakov Emden. You can see that they are reacting to certain processes that were taking place at the time. Someone just sent me that there's an academic article from a few years ago that's entitled Between Love and Misogamy, Changing Perceptions of Marriage Among German Jews Between 1750 and 1800. So I didn't have a chance to read it, but this idea that the attitude towards marriage among German Jews in Western Europe was already changing 1750 to 1800. 1800 is still before the Alter Rebbe even said this. This is the Alter Rebbe's Tafkuf Ayin Beis. That's 1812, or maybe the end of 1811. That's all in Western Europe. Whereas in Eastern Europe, these processes were much slower. But still, the winds were blowing. Different influences were definitely to be sensed and to be felt. And at some point, it also became tied up in the fight, the clash between Maskilim versus traditionalists, or Hasidim in particular, etc. And it would be possible that certain manhigim, certain leaders, even in Eastern Europe, already, let's say in 1811, 1812, or a year or so earlier, would have already been identifying this pattern. So even though these Makairis, the Alter Rebbe and the don't mention a word about the actual dynamic of marriage in their day, so this is somewhat speculative, but it is possible, according to this reading, according to this approach, this suggestion, to say that these Makairis, the Alter Rebbe, are in a sense already reacting generally to these winds that were blowing at the time, even without acknowledging it full on directly. But there is a link, there is a connection. And that would mean, therefore, that what we consider to be the Haredi approach today, and people are questioning it, that would mean that this stance has its roots going back as far as these sources here. Just to clarify, saying that this has a root in these Makairis doesn't mean that it's a full-on endorsement of the Haredi world, that everything is perfect, and it's very possible that things still need to be balanced properly, whether a little or a lot. But I'm really just trying to emphasize here that not to think that you're discovering America a year ago and discovered Yaakov and Rachel, and discovered love, you discovered romance. It's quite possible that these early Hasidic greats were already reacting to it in their way back then, by means of focusing on how you teach the psukim. Because if you teach the psukim differently, you say chas v'shalom, but teach the pasuk this way, so you kind of undermine the whole premise. And lahar, that the Welt says a word b'shem the Kotzker, that the pasuk says vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel, and then it continues and says vayisas koyle vayev, the Yaakov cried. The shayla is, why was he crying? Holidays, you have to ask why he's crying. So the Kotzker's vart is that he was crying because after he kissed Rachel, he realized, wait a second, a day is going to come when they're going to think this happened kipshutai, that this was a ma'ase that happened kipshutai. It's not very sad. So the Kotzker is also, this vart is expressing this point, and the way this vart is structured, also with the language, a day will come, seems to also imply that it's like a reaction to some kind of new phenomenon at that time. And so that would mean the Alter Rebbe is just a bit earlier than the Kotzker on this, if it's from the Kotzker at all. And I would also add that if it's true that the earlier Svarim, the early Mefarshim, were not as bothered by these psukim, by these stories to the same degree, although to really have to start analyzing different streams and approaches to understanding Torah, Sipurah Torah, Yiddishkeit. But just to generalize, if it's true that the early Mekayros were not as bothered, so the question is, why are suddenly the Alter Rebbe, etc., why are they suddenly bothered? So it's possible to interpret it as that it's all kind of a sort of backlash of the frum world, of the Haredi world of the last few hundred years, because the world is pulling it, before the world pulled in that direction. So the story of Vayishak didn't bother as much. There was no negative context for it per se. But once the negative context now presented itself, and we are defining ourselves in negation to that, so suddenly these psukim seem more problematic. So that creates this backlash that we have to say, no, chas v'shalom, you can't read these psukim this way. So for the earlier Mekubalim, I'm imagining, didn't research it, but I would imagine the style of the early Mekubalim, the physical and the spiritual sometimes just seems interwoven. That's my impression from Titus Harizal, etc., where there is a lot of physical descriptions of intimacy, etc., and it's very much tied and interwoven with the spiritual, and it doesn't seem like it's seen as troubling or problematic. Whereas in the Chassidish world, it seems to be a lot more, much more of a difficulty, a complex of reconciling the two, of seeing the two together. It's more black and white, and it's like you have to choose. So you want Kedusha and Ruchnius, or you want Gashmias. So if you have to choose, then we have to choose a Ruchnius and reject and say, Chas v'shalom, not the Gashmias. And at least on the sociological level, it's always good to ask whether if something comes into being as a reaction to something, whether that's the approach that needs to remain in place forever, or the reaction was in reaction to something. But anyway, right before I began, I came across Taka in the Sefer Agra Dekala by the Bnei Yissaschar. The Taka also has a shtickle here, Vayisa Yaakov l'Rachel, Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel, Vayisa Koyle Vayevk. Agra Dekala says, "Hakasav mashmienu bezel fi pshutoi goydel kedushas Yaakovinu." You know what the pasuk is telling us? How heilig Yaakov was. How do we see this from this pasuk? Shehaya inyan hazirug atzloi bli es bayish bnei adam. Intimacy to him wasn't embarrassing. He called Kach Haya Dovek Hashem Yisparach V'Asayis V'Tzaynai. He was so connected to the Eibusher to do what Hashem wants. At Shesham inyan hazar atzloi kitzitzis u'tfilin. So you have a mitzvah of tzitzis, you have a mitzvah of tefillin, you have a mitzvah of zivuk. There's no difference. You wouldn't be embarrassed to give the tefillin a kush in front of everybody. It's not awkward and embarrassing. So for anocha mitzvah, of kush in the mitzvah, okay, nashak l'rachel, chayfetz shal mitzvah, dafnei haraya, and Rachel is also a chapsa shal mitzvah, so he's kissing her in front of the others. Also, aliboy migodol dveikusa, you couldn't imagine, due to his great dveikus, she's a dover mechor b'enei habriyas, That people could do this. Couldn't imagine it. Meaning, even with Zman Shel Yaakov, Yaakov was the way he's describing it a little out of touch with how it would have come across even then. Yaakov was davok; he was in his own world. Okay, Yesh Leimar, the Mishum Hachi Bacha Nebazoi. If he his mouth, why did Yaakov cry? He was kissing, but he didn't do the full mitzvah, the proper mitzvah. Presumably, the zivug is the proper mitzvah, and he has to negotiate with Lavan, and that's going to take a whole long time. So he was longing to be the mitzvah, and he was crying. If he's a Novin Gamkein, you can understand the pasuk. He tells Lavan, "Hava is ishti v'avoya elah," and that already Chazal Yishayim Halikalsha b'Kalamena Iberkain. Give me my wife v'avoya elah. Actually, he was so divorced from Chumrius. Actually, all Ali wish is that he didn't realize that comes across wrong. Ashrei ish shekach aloi. Bnei Yisrael ends up. Agadakala ends up. It's gavaldik. Ashrei ish shekach aloi. So you also see that Bnei Yisrael is trying to. Is also reacting and trying to explain the pasuk in a chassidish oifen that will be acceptable from a chassidish perspective. By the way, his mention of that the zivul was without busha and like tefillin, etc., actually ties into something I looked into a few weeks ago in the Torah of the Tzemach Tzedek Parshas Lech Lechos before I started recording stuff, where the Tzemach Tzedek also has a similar lashon. Alter Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek has similar descriptions of Admo Medicine and La'asad Lavoi. So Agadakala is applying it to Yaakov, and also someone just sent me a few days ago that there mayfits that the Rebbe Chavar also has a zavart on Yitzchak, because you also have this question about Yaakov Avimelech. How did Yitzchak wasn't embarrassed with tznius? So weiter also that it's the same word Loyis B'Shashim, using this Yesod. So Agadakala also so you have all these Chassidish Mekayos that all seem to be dealing with this, reacting to this, each in their own way. But of course, to say anything definitively, one would have to do some thorough research and review all the Mekayos from all the different kufas to be able to have a clear, definitive maskana of how these psukim were discussed and dealt with. With regard to Sipuri HaTorah, I should also mention that the end of Tanya, the beginning of Kuntres Achrim begins, Lahavan Eicha Kairei, the Sipuri Ma'aseh Shabbatayra, Hu Mekusher B'Chachmi Allah. And I saw that in the beer of Rabbi Shua Korf, so I'm not so familiar with the Sefer. I see in the beginning it's supposed to be copied from other Mekayos. I didn't find this passage anywhere. I didn't have a chance to get to the bottom of whether this is Agonis or he copied it from somewhere, but he teaches what's the kasha, right? The whole Kuntres Achrim is written very technically, like a very dense technical Kabbalistic discussion. But what's the question? So the question is, when it comes to halacha is also gavoy mal gavoy baruchnius, but it's yored l'makom namach. The seichel understands the gashus. What you understand in your seichel, that's the chachmaser d'tzaynei. Shekei d'tzaynei is baruch. That's the psak din. The gam hayav la'yed over zol olam. But if it were to happen, this would be the ratzon alien. So when you learn the halacha, even if it's theoretical, you're makusher, the machshavte, the chachmaser d'tzaynei. When it comes to Sipuri Ma'aseh, even though it creates in the pshutai, so in that sense it seems not different than halacha. The halacha has a pshutai, a mikra Sipuri Ma'aseh has a pshutai, but it says the disconnect here is a much bigger disconnect. And ein leishum erech v'yachas hapshutai kepshutai. When you say ein mikra yet the pshutai, it's the pshutai is lefi the erech to the inyan ha'elyon. Whatever the deeper meaning is, there's also pshutai be'erech to that, but not. That's his wording there. It says Alderach and Tanya Perek Mem Hey, where it talks about the avodas of the office to be mamsha from Atzilas, Lamayla Atzilas, Rachmim Rabim from Knesset Yisrael to connect them to Erin Saif. What does the Alter Rebbe use there? The Alter Rebbe uses the pasuk like Yishak Yaakov L'Rachel. So that's an example. The Yav Yishak Yaakov L'Rachel. And the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya Perek Mem Hey what pshat in the pasuk is. So he says, okay, Nechshav L'Chet Gadol. Lispais hasipuri ma'asis kipshut levad. So if you were to take that and understand the kipshutai, that would be a chet gadol. So he's also representing the chassidish perspective here, and he's teaching it out. So that's the kasha of Alter Rebbe. Again, Kuntres Achrim lahavin eicha kairi b'sipuri ma'asis shabbat mekush b'chachmi Allah. If you're reading it and you don't have the inyan alien, and the pshutai that you have has no erech to the inyan alien, so that's not the pshutai, that's the pshutai. So all you have is just isis kadeshus. How you kasher the chachmi Allah now? Where's the intellectual engagement now? You've got nothing. And that's the kasha of Alter Rebbe. That's who explains kasha of Alter Rebbe. With that, we conclude for now. That's all after I try to be in the katzer. So just to summarize, we touched here where the Alter Rebbe we touched on Alter Rebbe's polemic against the Poshim that centered Yofi in some way. We have the polemic against those who understand Tzipuri HaTorah as Pashat Maisis, especially Maisis like this. On the other hand, there is some art for the concept of beauty in the Alter Rebbe's Torah as well, and that's what I hope to focus on more in the next installment. I also mentioned in passing this larger, interesting question about the place that beauty holds or doesn't hold in Chabad, and that's basically it. I think B'chlolos and Be'ezras Hashem we'll try to continue tomorrow, and with what else we can learn and glean from the way the Alter Rebbe wrote the Hanacha and the way the Alter Rebbe expanded on it in Torah's Chaim, and maybe we'll even, who knows, get to see if there are any Haggaros in the Tzemach Tzedek and Eretz HaTorah as well, and maybe we'll have some larger summary at the end of it all. As usual, I welcome all kinds of ha'aras, feedback, whether substantive especially, but even how you liked and appreciated or disliked and didn't appreciate what was discussed. Please and thank you. All right. Shekayach.